First of all, Luke, thanks very much for having me. I've got a hell of a story to share, one that I still have a little bit of trouble believing is true, but the more I've learned about it, the more evidence there is that this is what happened. Essentially, I am a bit of a geek for London history, very, very fascinated by the City of London, you know, the bit of probably the most powerful institution in the world that very, very few people know about, all the banking and so on, that was at the heart of the British Empire. And sort of around a particular architect, a guy called Nicholas Hawksmoor, there were a series of urban legends, urban myths. His name pops up in From Hell by Alan Moore, in a book called Hawksmoor by the amazing author Peter Ackroyd, and also a poet called Ian Sinclair wrote about Hawksmoor's churches. And he said if you map Hawksmoor's churches out, they make a pattern, and that pattern he called the shape of fear. So really, I was kind of fascinated by what people were saying about Hawksmoor, and the fact his churches seem to provoke quite a strong reaction in some very cool people. So the first thing I did was I put his churches on Google Earth. And as you can see, they do make a shape. This is what Ian Sinclair called the shape of fear. It's kind of obvious, let's say, that he was deliberately trying to make a shape because the distances between some of these churches are completely irregular, and he also set churches up so that they have particular lines of sight. He used like compulsory purchase powers to buy the land, and so the idea that he didn't have something in mind when he was doing this is really where what I started to question. People say this distribution of churches is random, but actually it's pretty easy to prove that they're not. My book is really me exploring what it is, what I think he was up to by putting the churches in those places in that order. Essentially, people say Hawksmoor's churches, the distribution of them is random, but if you go to the top of Greenwich Hill and look down over Greenwich Hospital that he and Wren built, in a direct line along the line of symmetry that the whole complex is built on, you follow that line of symmetry over the Isle of Dogs to the north, and about a mile and a bit away is the church he built, St Anne's Limehouse, which lines up directly with that line of symmetry. That's no longer visible because they built Canary Wharf on the Isle of Dogs, but for a couple of hundred years you'd have seen that Hawksmoor was exactly lining his churches up. There's no doubt that he was trying to do something with their placement on the map, if you like, their organisation. St Anne's Limehouse and the location of it proves that Hawksmoor was up to something with the location of his churches. And it was really by learning about Hawksmoor and what he was up to that I became aware of the work really of Sir Christopher Wren, who everyone sort of heard of. His work and he himself were really, really, really controversial. Christopher Wren was hated by a lot of people, especially the people who had fought on the parliamentary side of the Civil War. Christopher Wren's dad was actually in charge of the Order of the Garter, and the Order of the Garter was what Charles I had used to organise the Royalist army in the Civil War. So Christopher Wren's dad pretty much ran the intelligence side of the Royalist cause during the Civil War. So Christopher Wren's uncle was Bishop of Ely, in charge of Cambridge, and had persecuted lots of Protestant thinkers there. The Wren family were very, very, very deeply involved with the Stuart family, and for that reason, Christopher Wren was a very controversial figure. It's clear from what Hawksmoor said that Wren was very, very angry about the Great Fire of London. Hawksmoor was subject to all these kind of urban myths. There is something about the distribution of his churches, and when I was trying to find out about him, I came across this quote, which really, really struck with me, because this was written in the 1720s, so like a good 50 years after the fire of London. And he says, London should have been rebuilt, a convenient, regular city, excellent, skillful, honest artificers made by the greatness and quantity of the work in rebuilding such a capital, but instead it's all gone to shit. I mean, literally, he's angry about the way London's being rebuilt, and that really didn't make much sense to me at the time. He was angry about the Great Fire of London, and I just couldn't understand why anyone was angry about the Great Fire of London. It didn't make any sense to me. Over time, it became clear that it wasn't Hawksmoor's opinion, this really, it was Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren was very, very angry about the Great Fire of London. One day in particular, in the aftermath of the fire, he thought he was going to be able to rebuild all of London on a grid pattern. And this pattern was something he obviously thought about a lot and got ready in very, very, very quick time. In less than a week, he had plans to rebuild all of London. That wasn't a coincidence. He'd spent the previous summer, 1665, in Paris learning how to rebuild a town from the people who were doing it for Louis XIV. A guy called Jean-Baptiste Colbert was sort of Louis XIV's go-to guy for getting things done. And Wren spent time talking to the architects and even met the artist, the sculptor Bernini, when he was in Paris, learning in 1665 the basics of how to rebuild a city. So when he came back to London in 1666 and it all burnt down, he was ready with plans to rebuild all of London. So Wren was thwarted in this. It never happened. London wasn't rebuilt according to his master plan. His legacy, Wren's legacy, and how he passed on his responsibilities to Hawksmoor is really how I began to understand that maybe the Great Fire of London was not the accident we were all told it was when we go to school. It's pretty much the first thing every kid in Britain learns at school is about the Great Fire of London happening by accident because of a baker's shop burning down. Now, at the time, it's absolutely clear everyone thought it was arson. During the fire, a man called Edward Hyde, who was the Lord Chancellor, the head of Charles II's government, came to Charles II and said, look, everyone says this fire did not come by chance. Everyone says this fire was arson. There are a couple of notes on here that are worth mentioning. Like this quote from Hawksmoor talks about skillful, honest artificers being made by the greatness of the work. In other words, because London had burnt down and it was all going to be rebuilt in stone, there was a great opportunity to recruit and train masons. And on the 1717, on the 21st of June, a pub called the Goose and Gridiron, that's where the Freemasonry that's best known today is what's called Scottish Rite Freemasonry began. It began in that pub. Hawksmoor was there with Wren, and that was the beginning of what's called Scottish Rite Freemasonry. Now, very interestingly, previous to this, there was another form of Freemasonry that existed in London, and that was associated with the Worshipful Company of Masons, the business, the guild that looked after building in stone in London. Now, when the fire happened, King Charles II said to the Worshipful Company of Masons, you no longer have a monopoly. I'm going to get rid of your monopoly on rebuilding. And he gave all the work, instead of giving it to the traditional Worshipful Company of Masons, he gave all the work to Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren was using this as a recruitment tool for his Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And the previous, the popular form of Freemasonry in London was squeezed out. That's now known as Irish Rite Freemasonry. It was more egalitarian in its outlook, and it's sort of Masons associated with Irish Rite Freemasonry, who were behind the American Revolution and the French Revolution, for example, a much more radical bunch of people. The Scottish Rite Freemasonry that exists and dominates in England now is very, very, very monarchist and places the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem at the heart of their ritual. The Irish Rite Freemasons used to look back to Egypt and used to especially revere Euclid, the geometry guy. Two totally different belief systems. And as a result of the Great Fire of London, Christopher Wren and his friends were able to shoehorn in their version, their modern version of Freemasonry, which was called Scottish Rite, and involved total obedience to the king. When you learn about Christopher Wren, it became pretty obvious it was very controversial. I kept reading around the subject. There seemed to be a load of very strange coincidences concerning Wren. He was in Paris the previous year learning how to rebuild a city, and then lo and behold, the city burnt down. Looking into it further, I came across the fact that Parliament had investigated the fire. They'd formed a committee and investigated the fire, and this is just really the most amazing historical document I've ever read. You can find paper copies of it, but the best way I have it, the way I'd recommend getting access to it is via the University of Michigan. they've digitized a copy of this report, and you can see it starts upon the 2nd of September 1666. The fire began at one Farriner's house, a baker in Pudding Lane. Now, this was written, that sentence was written before the committee had even met. The first words written in the report were written before the committee had even met. It states that the fire started at the baker's in Pudding Lane. Now, the man who wrote those words, physically wrote those words into the report, the clerk of the committee, was a guy called Goldsborough. He then went to the City of London and told them what he'd been forced to write. They then paid him some money so he'd keep them informed. And you can see it says here that the 18th of September 1666 they met. It says the 2 and 20th of January had completed their report. So in January the report was ready to share, but Parliament was prorogued. The King disbanded Parliament to prevent this committee sharing its findings. You can see there, upon the 8th of February following, the Parliament was prorogued before they came to give their judgment thereon. So the King prorogued Parliament to stop this committee sharing what they found. And if you look at what they found, it's not surprising. Several people saying they saw arsonists, and we'll look at a couple. We can look at a couple of those in more detail. But this little paragraph here was written by Sir Robert Hooke, who was the chairman of the committee. Now, I had order from the committee to acquaint you, so he'd be saying this in Parliament. He'd be talking to the whole House of Parliament, that we traced several persons apprehended upon strong suspicion during the fire to the guards, but could not make any further discovery of them. In other words, there are people strongly suspected of committing arson, but they were lost because of the guards. Now, when I first came across this, I had no idea who the guards were, but I can tell you the guards were the King's Guard. That was the King's personal protection force. They were seen, or they were going around London, and they did repeatedly rescue people who'd been caught committing arson. So in other words, the King's band of brothers, his best mates, the guys who had sworn to protect him with their life, were going around London during the fire, rescuing people committing arson. And there's particular instances of this are detailed in the report. If we scroll on, it becomes clear why the King might want to have Parliament prorogued before this document was shared, because obviously if his best mates were rescuing arsonists, that kind of leaves him looking like the fire wasn't an accident. So you can see here, this is sworn testimony in front of 70 lords and MPs. In the time of a fire, a constable took a Frenchman firing a house. Someone was caught in the act of arson and was rescued by the Duke of York. That's the King's brother. His Highness the Duke of York, who asked the reason for the tumult. One told him that a Frenchman was taken firing a house. His Highness called for the man who spoke to him in French. The Duke asked who would bear witness, who would attest it. The constable said, I took him in the act and I will attest it. The Duke took him into his custody and said, I will secure him, but he was heard of no more. So again, an arsonist rescued by a friend of the King, in this case, his actual brother, the Duke of York. This is the guy James Stuart, who later became King James II. Just underneath that one, there's another instance, and this is more explicit. On Monday, there was a Frenchman taken firing a house, and upon searching him, fireballs were found about him. So there's physical evidence this guy was an arsonist. At which time, 4 of the lifeguard rescued the Frenchman and took him away from the people after their usual manner in the whole time of the fire. And you can see that bit's put in italics. That was in italics in the original report. So they're emphasizing that the lifeguard, the King's personal protection force, were rescuing arsonists. Now, to the MPs who had seen all these witnesses, it became clear that the fire could not have been an accident, because there were arsonists running around and multiple arsonists were caught. Again, all of those arsonists were rescued, taken out of the legal system by the King, the King's brother, and the lifeguard, the King's personal protection force. This deeply implicates Charles II in the fire.
So how many arsonists do you reckon, just like a ball figure, are mentioned in this report?
Okay, so there's a man called Robert Hooke who was caught and confessed to committing arson. He said he was one of 22 arsonists who've been recruited by a man called Stephen Peedlow. Robert Hooke undoubtedly confessed and was hung for committing arson. He acknowledged that he was the one that set fire to the bakers in Pudding Lane. He claimed it despite no one ever asking him. He volunteered his confession. Now, his case became kind of famous because Charles II, after the fire happened, just said, yeah, that was definitely an accident. It was an act of God. Now, what that meant was that anyone whose house had burnt down, because it was an act of God, they'd receive no insurance, no compensation, no help rebuilding. This meant that thousands of tenants would have to carry on paying their rent and pay to rebuild the house that they lived in that had been burnt down. They'd have to rebuild their landlord's house out of their own pocket. That would have meant thousands of people becoming homeless because no one could afford to do it. When Robert Hooke confessed, he legally changed the nature of the fire to being one where enemy action was involved. It was arson. If he confessed to arson, therefore the fire was arson. That changed everyone who lived in London's, I'm going to say, insurance arrangements. It meant they could get compensation. Hubert confessed, and essentially he said it was a man called Stephen Peatlow, who you can see here, recruited him. And he said he didn't want to do it, want to get involved out of any malice towards England or anything like that. He was just promised, I don't know what he was promised, but he was obviously promised something very nice by Stephen Peatlow.
This is a Frenchman. Or,
yes.
Peatlow. Yeah.
Now, again, some people who gave testimony to the inquiry said they knew Stephen Peatlow, and he was a man that wasn't to be trusted, you could say.
Is Robert French as well?
Robert Hubert, yeah, was from Normandy, yeah.
You can see a pattern emerging.
Well, yeah, and lots of people said that, again, in the testimony, in the report, they said they caught a Frenchman. They didn't catch a Dutchman or a German or whatever. They specified that the arsonists that had been caught were French.
You mentioned in your book that one of them shouted out in Latin, didn't he?
Yes, a man was found in a library that had just started to, spontaneously combusted or whatever. Again, this man was in disguise. I believe he had fireballs on him, and when he was caught, he started crying out, I think, Parce Domini Mihi, which means Lord protect me, Lord protect me. Now, if you're shouting out in Latin in London, which is a very Protestant town, you're causing yourself all kinds of trouble. I've made the comparison. I hope no one's offended by this, but it'd be a bit like shouting out Allahu Akbar on 9/11. The Catholics were the national enemy at the time. Shouting out things in Latin while all this was going on was likely to draw a crowd, and it did actually mean some people tried to beat up the arsonist for crying out in Latin. No one could quite understand what was going on, but the man had been dressed in black, and underneath him he had white clothes on. He'd done several things. I think he was wearing a wig, and he'd set fire to a library. Now, this is all attested to in great detail in the report. And again, that man disappeared.
Was he trying to make people think that he was from Rome then? Is that the intention there, trying to suggest that he's not a Frenchman? Or was it just that he was actually speaking Latin?
I think my take on it is that he was calling out a code phrase so people would know that one of them was in trouble. He started calling out in Latin, and lo and behold, the Duke of York rides up and takes him away. And again, someone wrote a very, very detailed witness statement to this effect and signed off on it to the parliamentary committee. And I should point out that if you said something against the crown, if you said something seditious that tended to undermine the government, you could be hung, drawn and quartered. So this witness, whose name was John Stewart, wrote down in his statement something that, if it wasn't true, could have had him hung, drawn and quartered, which would mean he's probably pretty clear that he was correct, because I don't think anyone wants to get hung, drawn and quartered. Same with the MPs. There are 70 of them. They signed off on this report. All these details were corroborated by members of parliament. And again, if any of this wasn't true, they could have been arrested and tried for sedition and hung, drawn and quartered. But this is a parliamentary report. And again, rather than let it be debated in Parliament, Charles II prorogued Parliament to stop any of this information becoming common knowledge. Subsequent to that, he disbanded the committee, and the committee members were so outraged by this that they got together all the witness statements and published them, which is why there's paper copies of this report. Charles II had that report confiscated and burnt. It was illegal to own a copy of the parliamentary findings. So Jesus. Yes. And then again, some people say, oh, this is all nonsense. This report's all nonsense. But 13 years later, when he was in control of Parliament, Charles II had this report reprinted, but with all the details about arsonists taken out. So if it was just a nonsense that no one cared about, why edit it and reprint it 13 years later?
Yeah, unless he's trying to falsify the history a bit.
Exactly.
So do you want to talk about the the inconsistencies in the fire and like how it just kind of erupted all over the city, and there was that person that watched, wasn't there, from a tower?
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So, I mean, there are several aspects to the fire that are not well known. And I'd say the most shocking one to me was learning that London's water supply had been turned off the night the fire started. I'll say that again. The piped water in the city of London had been turned off deliberately before the fire started. A reservoir up in Islington in North London had been built, and it was the New River Company supplied pressurised water into London. Now, a man called John Graunt, who connected to the Stuarts in lots of different ways, Captain John Graunt, on the night the fire started, turned the water off. He locked the doors and walked away with the key. London, for the first time since the New River Company had started business about 30 odd years before, London had no piped water. So, way to fight a fire, you'd smash the local pipe, the water pipe near where the fire was, and get your water out of there to fight the fire. Now, that wasn't possible the night that the fire started because all the pressurised water had gone. John Graunt later was asked why he turned the water off. He said, "Oh, I'd forgotten I did it. And I forgot I took the keys away from me." Yeah, I know, right? His sort of connections to the king just meant he never faced any consequences from that. There are other details like that. The water wheels that pump water up from the river all broke that night. And it just seems incredibly unlucky if you're an insurance assessor, an actuary or whatever, and you, lo and behold, someone turned off the sprinkler system and then their house burnt down. That's very suspicious, right?
Yeah, definitely.
The guy went up a church spire during the fire of London and said he looked out and saw fires starting all over the place. The church near him, it was several hundred yards from any of the fires at the time. The church called St. Lawrence Pulteney seemed to spontaneously combust. The spire went up without there being any fire anywhere near it. So this Thomas Middleton, this witness, seeing this over several hours, fires starting all over the place where there'd been no fire there before, made him sure that the fire was arson because there's no way the fire could move like that. Also, we get told nowadays that the fire started in Pudding Lane and got blown westwards across London. But in the parliamentary report, they make clear that the fire also got to Southwark, which meant the fire going across the river, south of the River Thames, and going upwind. Now, no natural fire can jump a river and travel upwind. It gets blown downwind, right? So we never get told nowadays that parts of Southwark got burnt down because that wouldn't make sense if it was all an accident. But in the parliamentary report, the bloke whose pub got burnt down was very clear. Southwark did get burnt. Again, an arsonist was caught. And again, the Royal Lifeguard, the King Charles's personal protection force, rescued the arsonist. So the narrative we get now that the fire's growth was sort of gradual was not borne out by what the witnesses saw. The fire was starting all over the place. There are probably at least a dozen arsonists mentioned in the report, all of whom disappeared, all of whom, I'm going to say, rescued by the Stuarts.
And just to think how many weren't even, caught at all, how many got away. And that dude's saying 22 in his team.
Yeah, Robert Hooke was obviously a bit of a strange man. You've got to look at it one of two ways. Either he confessed to the fire when he had nothing to do with it, which makes him very strange, or he confessed to the fire, which would be an odd thing to do. But there is...
and he was hanged for it, wasn't he?
He was hung, yeah. The guy who later became the Archbishop of Canterbury, a guy called John Tillotson, was very, very interested in Hubert's case. John Tillotson, when William of Orange came over and became King of England after the Glorious Revolution, John Tillotson was his closest advisor, Englishman, closest advisor to William of Orange. So by no means a fringe figure. John Tillotson was clear his whole life that the Great Fire of London was arson, as was another guy called Gilbert Burnet, who was Bishop of Salisbury. Lots of people. There's a guy called Sir Patience Ward, who became Lord Mayor of London. He was sure that the fire was arson. Lots and lots of very, very serious establishment people with reputations to protect were very clear the fire was arson, all of them. After the death of Charles II and his brother James II became king, James II was James Stuart, the guy who had been caught, or rather who'd been seen rescuing arsonists. And the City of London and the parliamentary Whig party just couldn't stomach having James Stuart as king. And so they organised the Glorious Revolution, and England was successfully invaded by the Dutch at Parliament's invitation. So John Tillotson, who was central to the Glorious Revolution, became Archbishop of Canterbury, was of the opinion that the Great Fire of London was arson. And so were many, many other establishment figures.
So yeah, we've got somebody who saw it erupting in different places. From the Thomas Middleton from the top of this tower literally saw it erupting in different places. It's
Yeah.
jumped a river and gone against wind, which it shouldn't be able to do. The water was turned off the day before, and the guy took the keys home with him so nobody else could turn it back on. The
Yes.
water wheels were broken the night before,
Yes.
and 22 at least, well, at least 12, but 22 according to Robert Hooke, Frenchmen were in the city throwing firebombs at things. So who has done this? Obviously it's the king, but why has he done this? Is the question.
Well, it's not well known, but again, this is part of my, I'm going to say, fascination with the City of London. But I understood for a long time that it was the City of London who had really defeated the King Charles I, in the English Civil War. Charles I had had all kinds of trouble with Parliament and had wanted to arrest 5 MPs. Those MPs had gone into the City of London, which at the time had its medieval wall and gates. And the king had rode after these MPs, tried to arrest them, and the City of London had just shut its gates on the king and said, no, you can't have them, no, you can't come in. That was the beginning of the English Civil War. The king was defied by the City of London. The Civil War did not go well for Charles I. He ended up getting his head cut off, and his children had to escape to France. So when his children and his family were invited back in 1660, after about 10 years in exile, you can imagine that they had quite a few chips on their shoulder about having their father executed, having all their titles and their status removed. For a while, they were basically refugees, you could say, aristocratic refugees in Europe. And when they came back, the Stuarts and the Stuart faction, the Tory faction, took revenge. I'm going to say it is no accident that, unlike any other city in the history of the world, not even the Bible do you find a town that's been hit by fire, famine, war, and disease. None of these things were accidents. The war we could talk about was with the Dutch. That was a naval war. It went terribly. The fire we've started to talk about, all the people there at the time were clear that the fire was arson. And the disease, the plague that hit London, was unlike any outbreak of bubonic plague before or since. Epidemiologists have, studied the bubonic plague, and there are articles that say we can explain every major outbreak of this disease, except the one that happened in London in 1666. So yeah, in the aftermath of the fire, Christopher Wren was incredibly focused. He and his best friend, some people say they may have been more than friends, but his best friend, Robert Hooke, another scientist, went around and they measured the entire footprint of London whilst the fire was still sort of burning down, the story goes. Robert Hooke and Christopher Wren managed to produce some incredibly detailed maps of London in the aftermath of London. They had all the equipment ready to do the measuring. They had they had a plan for how to do it. And in incredibly short time, Wren and Hooke were in the prime positions to organise the rebuilding of London. And these two friends, they'd been friends since school, and they were both dyed-in-the-wool royalists. They were supporters of the Stuart family. It was very, very suspicious to people on the other side of the political argument. You could call them the Whigs, the people who'd fought on the parliamentary side in the Civil War. They were very suspicious that Wren and Hooke were so well prepared after disaster struck. So you can see this incredibly elaborate plan he had drawn up within days of the fire. There's something about Christopher Wren being incredibly lucky. He spent the year previous learning how to rebuild towns in Paris. He came back and he had a whole town to rebuild. Also, he'd been on part of a committee looking at how to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral. I think it was on the 27th of August, 1666, he got permission to start doing work on the old St. Paul's Cathedral. So he stuck up loads and loads of scaffolding, and the story goes that he wanted to repair the roof. So he had gallons and gallons, hundreds of gallons of tar put on the scaffolding around the old St. Paul's Cathedral. What happened when the fire hit the old St. Paul's Cathedral is it went up like a candle. It burnt down incredibly quickly. And that wouldn't have happened had Wren not had scaffolding around it covered in tar. Wren hated the old St. Paul's Cathedral for architectural, stylistic reasons. He wanted to rebuild all of London in a baroque style, which was the sort of style officially nominated a Catholic style. His desire to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral came true as did the opportunity to rebuild a whole town in Baroque style. He got incredibly lucky that things just seemed to happen for Christopher Wren in a way that I think defies probability, as well as the water being turned off, arsonists running about. Some buildings, it seems, were prepared, including the old St Paul's Cathedral, to go up in smoke when the fire struck. So there were several, if you like, dominoes placed in a row before the fire even started.
Was St. Paul's Cathedral the one where they were keeping all the books, like all the historical books and stuff?
Well, there were book markets around St. Paul's, and so what actually happened is when the fire struck, all the booksellers, as was the sort of the traditional way of dealing with this, they put all their books in the cellar. So hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of books went up at the same time as the scaffolding covered in tar did. So again, either Christopher Wren was incredibly lucky, or he was up to no good. And I have to say, the more you look at the number of ways he got incredibly lucky, you can't put that down to chance.
I mean, well, it's like you said, if the insurance company came in and you turned off your sprinklers the night before, that's suspicious. If you turned off the sprinklers and then came running in with, guys, I've drawn up a new plan of how the building can look when you rebuild it.
Yeah. While the building's still burning, I've got the plans for the new one. Yeah,
exactly. It's very suspicious, isn't it?
It just defies the narrative we get told. I think this is why we British get taught this when we're 5, because we go, oh, okay, London burnt down because of an accident. You don't think about it. There's a lovely quote that I found. This is the guy Edward Hyde, who was had been Charles II, the head of Charles II's government. And this is, you were asking before about maybe why this all happened. Just to reiterate, the City of London had bought and paid for the Civil War. They bought and paid for Cromwell to remove the king so that they could get on with King Charles I, who was the father of King Charles II, under whose reign the fire happened. Now, according to Clarendon, the fire was the greatest blessing that God had ever conferred upon Charles II. For the walls and gates being now burnt down and thrown down of that rebellious city, which was always an enemy of the crown, His Majesty would never suffer them to repair or rebuild the walls up again, to be a bit in his mouth and a bridle on his neck, but would keep all open, and that his troops might enter the city whenever he wanted. Head of King Charles II's government, Edward Hyde, was clear that the best thing that ever happened to Charles II, apart from his becoming king, was that the fire of London happened, because it meant that rebellious city would no longer have walls and gates and no longer be in a position to defy the king. During the fire, Charles and his brother James started moving around the city, started giving orders, showing themselves to be on the city's side. And the man who was Lord Mayor of London, a guy called Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was a blithering idiot and did nothing. So it was very, very, very good PR for the Stuarts that they were seen to be this dashing pair of dynamic heroes helping London out during the fire. According to everyone who knew him, especially his head of government, the fire of London was the best thing that ever happened to Charles II, because it meant that the walls and the gates were gone and the City of London could be treated like any other part of the country, i.e. subject to the royal will. And for hundreds of years, at least since the Magna Carta, the City of London had been self-governing, and had, the merchants and the bankers there had been gotten used to being, used to being control of their business. And it was really Charles I's attempt to limit the City of London that caused the Civil War, because the Crown under Charles I had wanted to lay down the law to the City of London, and the City of London weren't having it. That's what started the Civil War, and that's why when Charles I's son came back in 1660, I would say he had a chip on his shoulder about the city and a desire to see it brought low.
And then obviously that leads into where he ends up building these new churches, which was the point which brought you to this book in the first place.
Sure. What happened was the Wren street plan was not implemented. Christopher Wren was very, very angry about that. It was the 18th of September 1666. Charles II said, right, no one rebuild anything. We're going to build London. We're going to rebuild London on a grid plan. It's all going to be marvelous and wonderful. Nobody build anything. And then by the afternoon, of the 18th of September, Charles II had changed his mind. He said, no, you can build as you were. And what had happened was a delegation from the City of London had gone from the city to Westminster and said to the king, look, if this town has just burnt down in mysterious circumstances, and now you're saying we can't rebuild our houses on our land, then you're a tyrant. We don't believe this was an accident, and we're going to rebel against you and do to you what we did to your father. I execute you. Charles II therefore changed his mind and said, no, all right, we're not going to rebuild on a grid system. We're not going to do any of that. And he vacated the City of London. That made Christopher Wren very, very angry. Now, Charles II, I guess, had the decision to make. Would he annoy all the bankers and all the richest people in the country, or one 5'2" tall architect? And so, Christopher Wren lost out, and he's very angry for the rest of his life. You can read anything Wren said about architecture and about Charles II. He was bitter that he didn't get to build this. So the idea that all of this was an accident doesn't fit with the historical facts.
Yeah, definitely not. So do you want to talk about the rebuilding of the churches now, or should we
thank you. The Wren plan was shelved and London rebuilt on its original street plan. But in 1711, the Tory government at that time wanted to try and do something to impose some kind of godly order, you could say, on the godless, rebellious city of London. And so what they did was they created the 50 Churches Act of 1711. This is the act that meant Hawksmoor could build his churches. And the plan was to build 50 parish churches across London and pepper London with these very, very, very robustly built parish churches. Now, the parish church was the seat of local government. It's where, you had to go to church on Sunday. You had to pay your local taxes there. It was where the local police were organised, where, they'd organised the local jail. The local law and order was all run out of the parish church. So 50 of these parish churches would have been like putting 50, if you like, police stations. By putting these 50 churches in, they were trying to change the recipe of London, if you like. These were going to be very, very conservative Church of England, high Tory churches where people were expected to go every week and learn about their duty to be obedient to God and to the king.
Is it like your morality police kind of thing?
Very much so, yeah. And the idea was 50 of these churches would be enough to change the culture of London to make it more obedient. And this was the bill where under which Hawksmoor built his churches. They only ended up building 12 because the Tories got kicked out of government and the Whigs wanted nothing to do with it. But this was still part of the ongoing Tory-Whig battle for control of the capital of England. London was a much more egalitarian place at the time. There was less lords, ladies, dukes, duchesses, the aristocratic hierarchy. It was more or less meritocratic. And it was London and Londoners that the Stuart family blamed the Civil War for. They thought that it was those people and that rebellious town that had caused the Civil War, and they were broadly correct. What they wanted to do was impose these 50 churches on London and impose morality police, impose conformity. So that was the point of the 50 Churches Act that Hawksmoor used, or Hawksmoor was commissioned by to build his churches. So he was very much a Tory, he was very much a royalist, and he wanted to use his churches to impose law, you could say law and order on London.
You talk about sort of like the way that they change the style for depending on the area in London. So is it where the poorer areas, they got like the horrible imposing church, and then obviously the rich areas get this beautiful
yes. So what a lot of people point out is that the churches Hawksmoor built were very, very, very different to one another. They're all built for the same purpose under the same act, but depending on where they were, he'd build a completely different church. The churches in the East End were very, very austere. And there's actually a little bit of architectural language that I learned, which is the columns represent the people. Now, in the East End churches, the columns are very plain to represent the very plain people of the East End. In the West End church, the columns are much more decorous. They're what's called Corinthian columns with lots of nice ornamentation on them. That's because the West End was posh. So he was literally, if you knew the code, if you like, he was literally building into the fabric of these churches the economics of the area. So these different styles of column, if you knew the coding behind it, if you knew the language behind it, would tell you what kind of area this was. He was building in to the fabric of the churches the relative wealth or poverty of the different parishes they were in. The church he built in the middle of the city of London, he based on the Temple of Solomon as described in the Bible. That's a very, very beautiful and ornate church. The churches he built in the East End were much more robust, much less decorous, much more about herding the, getting the plebs in, telling them, reading them the riot act, if you like, getting them to conform to good Christian morality.
And so the whole point is control, is that to keep people who in the lower end like feeling like fear God, be a good person kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the part of the sort of design brief was to make these churches solemn and awful, make them imposing, make them so they look like God meant business. And if you look at these churches, some of the walls on these churches are like 1 meter thick. There's absolutely no structural reason to build something that robust. They look like castles, plonked in the middle of town. These huge, formidable buildings were there deliberately to intimidate the locals.
We see that same thing, don't we, today? Even with government buildings, things like that, you find that they'll just be disgusting concrete towers with barely any windows on them, and it's just because it's imposing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, a fun fact is that St Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren deliberately designed that to make you feel dizzy. It's an architectural effect called the trompe d'oeil, the triumph of the eye or something like that. It's in French. But when you look up at the roof of St Paul's and then you see the dome, it draws the eye up, and it was deliberately designed to make you feel kind of a bit dizzy, a bit intimidated, and feel the power of God. The buildings were deliberately designed to intimidate.
You wouldn't believe so much goes into the architecture. You'd think it was more about, what looks nice, but someone sat there going, what's going to make them feel terrified?
Yes. Yeah, Christopher Wren was keen to let people know that God was watching them. Like his dad and his uncle were both very, very senior clergy, bishops, and they were very, very much into the idea that you owed the king obedience in the same way you owed God obedience, absolute obedience. You have no rights whatsoever. You just do what you're told because that's the way creation was made. Christopher Wren's cousin wrote something that said, he was very anti-democratic. And he said, look, if you go back to the Bible, the people of Israel did not get a vote on the 10 commandments. God imposed the 10 commandments. That's the way the world works. The people of Israel, God is not a democratic entity. The people of Israel were told by Moses they didn't get a vote on it. So that's how it should be now. That was Nicholas Wren, Christopher's cousin.
And so there's also a bigger shape to this, isn't there, to the placement of the churches, which goes beyond, the design of the churches themselves, the actual placement. What's that about?
Well, this is really the what I try and flesh out in the book. There are different people have different interpretations. My interpretation of why Hawksmoor did this is pretty convoluted, but it involves his Freemasonry, because he was obviously a Freemason. And it involves kind of one of the stories that it seems Freemasons like. I'm going to say, I don't know quite how to put it, but the story of Isis and Osiris is a very, very old Egyptian story. A lot of people say, for good reason, it's got a lot of elements that seem to foreshadow the story of Jesus. The figure of Horus in this story, I'm sure most people know. Born on December 25th of a virgin birth, he fought evil, and he was eventually restored when he defeated his evil uncle Seth. But in that story, there's the one thread of that story is the part about the eye of Horus, and Horus losing his eye, and the god Thoth putting the eye back together again and putting it back in Horus's face so he could defeat his evil uncle. For whatever reason, the priesthood of Thoth, who was the god of wisdom and letters, was something that the Freemasons really identified with. They considered themselves, or at least some of them did anyway, to be like the priesthood of Thoth, i.e. the people who put the Eye of Horus back together and helped defeat the forces of chaos. My take on this alludes to that. Do you want? I'm kind of reticent to say exactly what it says in the book because it always sounds so preposterous. From my point of view, it seems he was making almost like a riddle or a puzzle that wouldn't be without precedent in Freemasonry. The placement of the churches. If you'd sat on Greenwich Hill in the southeast of London, looked out, you'd have been able to see them all. And it's kind of like a dot to dot. He was making a dot to dot of the Eye of Horus, which is one of the principal symbols of Freemasonry.
That's incredible. I mean, when I saw that, I found it just like, whoa, but it makes sense, like you say. The Freemasonry, the connection to Horus, that I love all the connections to the solar mythology behind it all, especially because that's what it all boils down to. Most people will get offended by that, but Christianity is essentially just a mishmash of others, but it's focused solely on Egyptian. And definitely comes from that Horus element.
Yes.
Like you say, born to the Virgin, we all see Virgin in the sky as Virgo. I don't know if you've ever heard of all that stuff like Bethlehem. You've read Alan Wilson's books, haven't you? So you've seen like Bethlehem, meaning like house of bread meaning Virgo.
Yeah.
Even the original Jewish New Year, Tishri 1 is it's bang in the middle of September usually, but it's the beginning of the new year. That's how they saw it. So you can see it, can't you? A new son being born to the Virgin is basically just saying, the new year's been born. We've just had our harvest in August, and now there's a new son passing through the Virgin, and this is a new year. So it's a new son in a new year, and that's just the cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think someone brought to my attention years ago that Jesus' birthday is literally the perfect day for a solar king or solar deity to be born on, because it's it's just when the sun starts rising up in the sky again. I mean, the whole Isis and Osiris story being at least 1,500, 2,000 years older than the story of Christ, and having all those similarities. Anyone who wants to say that's a coincidence is
well, you've also got Mithras as well, haven't you? Mithras is connected to that date, as well as I think Sol Invictus.
Yeah, I mean, it was a good day. It's astronomically very, very solid day. You always know when that day is because the sun's a bit higher.
Well, it's the day that light finally overcomes the darkness, but it hasn't won the battle yet. It doesn't win the battle until the spring equinox, when day finally overtakes nighttime and it becomes the dominant force for 6 months. When you learn it all, it suddenly starts to make sense, doesn't it? And you realize, like, oh, okay, they were just trying to tell me through like a story,
Yeah, I mean, it makes more sense to me than the creator of the universe, created the earth, and then because he had a problem with us eating fruit, cursed us all to eternity because of a talking snake, and then I mean, none of it makes sense, does it? I mean, I should say one thing that happened during Hawksmoor's time that was sort of certainly shook a lot of people was a translation of the work of Josephus, the Roman historian. Now, if you read any copy of Josephus's history from the Middle Ages, it says Jesus did this, Jesus did that, Jesus did the other, because people wrote it wrote in these bits about Jesus. When they did the translation of the original, the oldest copy they could find of Josephus doesn't mention Jesus, the Son of God of Nazareth, and all of that once. And that means that the best historian who was around and writing about the time Jesus was supposed to be there doesn't mention him once, which made Hawksmoor and so on very, very skeptical about the existence of Jesus as an historical figure, which I think is justified, because there isn't anyone who talks about Jesus until long after he died, in whatever you want to say, 30 odd AD. No one mentions him till about 40 or 50 years later. There were hundreds of people writing at the time who would write down anything, if there was a comet, people would mention that. If there was a bad harvest, people would mention that. But they don't mention this guy walking around preaching peace.
I believe as well in the records, it's somewhere around 70 AD. One of the Roman generals has gone to Jerusalem and caused some havoc there. And
Yes.
one of the Jewish kings said, "Oh, you are the Messiah that
Yes.
was
Yeah. Yeah.
proclaimed."
No, that person who said, "Yeah, you are the Messiah," that was Josephus. He had been
Right.
the leader of the Israeli army in the north. The Romans had just killed them all, and Josephus, saw the general, but would soon be the emperor Vespasian, and saw him and
That's the
said, "You
one,
know
yeah.
what? You know who you are? You're the Messiah, as prophesied by our holy books. You're the fucking man, right?" And Vespasian went, "Oh, come with me." And so Vespasian ended up taking this guy Josephus home to Rome, and it was Josephus who ended up writing an awful lot of the history of the era.
Right.
And
Okay. Yeah.
it was
Makes
the
sense.
Flavian family. Vespasian became emperor after Nero, and his family, the Flavian family, took over. They became the imperial family. It was that family that produced all the first bishops, built the first churches. That family were well into Christianity long before most people had even heard of it.
I don't know how much of Alan Wilson's stuff on the original Christianity you follow, with the whole, Caradoc gone to Rome, first son, Linus, first bishop of Rome, being the son of Caradoc, stuff like that.
I find the fact that there was a British Christianity very, very, very early, like, that's compelling. That's obviously happened. I'm not clear that Caradoc converted the Romans. I don't know about that. What I do know is that the Flavian family built all the first churches, were all the first bishops, and did control the Roman Catholic Church, not the British Apostolic Church, but the Roman Catholic Church was very much a creation of the Flavian family.
So yeah, anyway, is that everything about Hawksmoor and Wren that you wanted to talk about?
Well, one thing that's probably worth mentioning that isn't well known is that the first official history of the Great Fire of London was published in 1923. So for a few hundred years, no one had ever written down a history of the Great Fire of London. And that book by a guy called Walter George Bell is the book from which all your teachers and all the history books today draw their information from. He does in that mention the parliamentary report, but then just says they're all a bunch of fanatics and they didn't know what they were talking about. But yeah, for several hundred years, no one really spoke about the Great Fire of London. It went quiet, and it's very interesting, I think, to find out why. Because at the time, it was very clear that everyone in the Whigs versus Tory debate, every Whig was clear that the Great Fire was arson, and that was one of the main reasons why later on the Whigs organised the Glorious Revolution and got rid of James II, who in the parliamentary report was James, Duke of York, and rescuing arsonists. So the Whigs versus the Tories went on as a battle for over 100 years. They hated each other. Their families had fought each other in the civil wars. And eventually, the Whigs and the Tories realised that if they didn't bury the hatchet and get together, they were going to collectively lose power to the Chartists and the Liberals and the people who wanted to give women the vote and that sort of thing. So what happened was that these two factions, the Whigs and the Tories, who had hated each other over the generations, got together in the 1820s, and in 1834 created the modern Conservative Party, which is, everyone's favourite political party, right? These two people, what a great, they're two really horrible bunches of people, the Whigs and the Tories, and they got together and managed to make something even worse when they got together. But what they did do was they agreed to bury the hatchet. For example, there was a bishop of Salisbury called Gilbert Bennet, and he was the one who wrote down the fact that London's water was turned off by John Graunt. Now, his book, The History of My Own Time, details loads of stuff about the fire, loads of stuff about what was going on at the time. And if you read a version of it after 1830, all of that information has been edited out. All the stuff about the Great Fire is gone. But if you find a version online, which I have, before 1830, there's a huge amount of information about what was really going on at the time. I mean, I'll show you this. This is my print version of his book, Gilbert Bennet, History of My Own Time. You can see, I don't know, it's just about an inch thick. The real version's about that thick, and all of that stuff has been taken out of this history by the Bishop of Salisbury. It goes on and on and on. History was rewritten on an industrial scale. Another fun fact was that Samuel Pepys's diaries weren't published until 1825. No one even knew who he was. The original diaries were written in naval code. Samuel Pepys worked at the Navy. He wrote his diaries in code, and someone translated them in 1825. Now, the people who translated them were people involved in making the Tories and the Whigs friends. So the publishing of Samuel Pepys' diary and that version of events where Samuel Pepys tells about burying his cheese and this, that, and the other, that was all created 150 years after the actual fire. So Samuel Pepys, I've got no idea what it actually says in his diary, and nor do very many people, because it's written in naval code, right? No one can read it. So you're relying on the translators of that naval code to being trustworthy, let's say, to know whether or not what he says in that, what is written in that diary was really what he thought. But there was a concerted effort, I'm going to say, that other diaries from the era were published. The writer Daniel Defoe wrote a book called The Diary of the Plague Year, about the year 1665. He was about 4 when the plague happened, but the book he wrote vilifies the victims of the plague. He basically says that the people in London were so corrupt and so degenerate, the plague was almost deserved by the people of London. There was an attempt by the Whigs and the Tories in the early 19th century, 1800s, to paper over the cracks and bury this story. And that's the history we get taught now.
Do you want to go into the plague then, now that we've mentioned it?
Sure. I mean, this is very, very weird, but true. I can tell you 2 things that are absolutely true that I very much doubt you'll have heard before. One is that there was a way of not getting plague. You could keep yourself safe. And that had been known about for hundreds of years, and that was nutmeg. Nutmeg, when you eat it, means no insect will bite you. And it is the reason why nutmeg was the most expensive commodity in the world at that time, because everyone in the know, including, the aristocracy and so on, everyone knew that if you had nutmeg, you didn't get plague. That made it a very, very, very valuable commodity. Now, in 1664, we started an unprovoked war against the Dutch, and the Dutch had a monopoly on nutmeg. We stole all the Dutch nutmeg and brought it back. I say we, the Royal Navy stole the Dutch nutmeg and brought it back to London. Samuel Pepys, who worked for the Navy, records in his diary that they all made a fortune that year because they pirated so much Dutch shipping. Tons of nutmeg were one of the things that they stole. Now, at the same time, let's say, or around that era, the Christopher Wren's best friend, Robert Hooke, had been conducting an incredibly detailed study of fleas. He kept fleas, I guess, probably at the Royal Society. I don't think you keep them at home. And he produced this picture of a flea that was published in his book Micrographia in 1665. You'll see that this is an incredibly detailed picture of the flea. He writes about it in incredible detail in the book. Robert Hooke was the biggest expert in fleas in the world at the time when the plague hit London. The plague that hit London is unlike any other major outbreak of plague in the history of the bubonic plague. There are epidemiologists who have looked at this, and there's a chain of events that happens. There's a boom and bust in the rat population in the sort of Central Asia. As the rats die off, the fleas look for new hosts, so they jump to humans because they've got no one else to feed off. And you can see there's a chain of transmission that epidemiologists can trace in every major outbreak of the plague. It starts in the Middle East, sort of goes up through Italy, up into southern France, through France, up to Holland and Belgium, and then over the Channel to England, all by boat. But there's a chain of transmission. Now, in 1665, nowhere else had been hit by plague on a scale anything like this. So people at the time were saying, well, this is strange, because normally, we'd have heard about the plague coming through Italy, through France. We'd have heard about it. But no, it's only landed in London. And epidemiologists say they cannot explain how that happened. But people who hated the city of London had become expert in fleas and had loads of nutmeg. Now, I can't tell you exactly what happened, but again, the situation was very well managed. John Graunt, the man who had turned off the water to London on the night of the fire, was responsible for keeping what were called the records of deaths in London. The different parishes would record how many people had died in each area and what of. And you collected those bills of mortality together, John Graunt, and was able to assess, therefore, how bad the plague was in different areas. It was John Graunt's advice to the wealthy that they move out of London when the plague hit. Once it hit a certain number of deaths per parish, he said, oh, now's the time to leave. It was his advice, once the death numbers had come down again, to say, yeah, now it's safe to come back. John Graunt had set up this system of monitoring deaths a few years prior, and was instrumental in collating the number of deaths and keeping the records during the plague. So you have some people who are all very close to one another, involved in a number of ways in these different incidents. Robert Hooke, who drew the flea, also helped measure London after the fire. John Graunt, who turned off the water to London, helped keep a tally on the plague deaths before the fire. Christopher Wren was best friends with both of them. Also say, very interestingly, a lady called Lisa Jardine was an expert on Wren, is of the opinion that this picture of the flea is actually not by Hooke, because if you look at a lot of Hooke's pictures, they're good, but they're not this good. She thinks that this and a couple of other pictures in Hooke's book, Micrographia, was actually drawn by Christopher Wren, who was, by all accounts, an absolutely amazing draftsman. So somehow or another, Hooke and maybe Wren had got these fleas, bred them, learnt about their life cycles, learnt about what they like to eat, learnt everything they could about fleas, and drew incredibly detailed images of them.
The Navy goes and gets all of the nutmeg, brings it back to England, and then they suspiciously have a giant plague outbreak, like you say, that's focused on London. There isn't a path coming from Europe that you'd expect to see in the ports moving over, and it's just decimated London. And the people again seem to have had an idea of it before it's happened. And the same group of people that have been involved in the fire.
It's a very small circle of people. If you were up to this sort of thing, I imagine you'd want to know each other very well and trust each other an awful lot. But it just seems some remarkable coincidences. Well, I'd heard of John Graunt because of these bills of mortality. When I read the Bishop of Salisbury saying it was John Graunt who turned off the water to London, what are the chances of that? What are the chances of that? I mean, I got unlucky in two massive disasters. I just so happened to be there with his mate Christopher Wren as the building's burning, going, look, I've got a new plan for the. I mean, it doesn't bear scrutiny, and it's taken. I've read around this era an awful lot, and whenever you come across someone who was actually there, they're really clear that some weird stuff was going on. These weren't a natural series of events at all. So I can't tell you exactly what happened with regard to the plague, but I can tell you there's some incredible coincidences. Another one was that Robert Hooke suggested to the Lord Mayor of London that because as the plague hit, that they should kill all the cats and dogs in the city, because cats and dogs might be the things spreading the plague. Well, as we know now, if you kill all the cats and dogs, that means there's nothing to catch the rats that really are spreading the plague. Robert Hooke, or his best mate Wren, drew a beautiful image of a flea, knew all about the fleas, and then suggested to the Mayor of London that because once the plague had hit, that they kill all the cats and dogs, and this would have meant, meant party time for the rats who were actually spreading it. Again, John Graunt, who turned off the water before the fire, was there during the plague, keeping an eye on how many people were dying where. These are all things that definitely did happen. You have to really wonder about the kind of people who would spread a pathogen like that.
Probably the same type of people that burned down a city.
Yeah, I guess you could put, yeah. It's kind of hard to fathom though, isn't it? I mean, Hooke was a madman. I mean, a dangerous madman. Here's another interesting thing about Hooke. I mean, he pretty much was the first professional scientist in England. He got employed by the Royal Society to do loads of experiments and this, that, and the other. But then when Isaac Newton took over the Royal Society, Isaac Newton had Hooke's portrait burnt. Now, your portrait is obviously quite a big deal. It's your way of being remembered. And Isaac Newton wanted to destroy Robert Hooke's image, his memory.
For some reason, Newton really hated him.
Yeah, yes. And people say it was to do with gravity or to do with this, that, and the other. Newton did famously say, if I've seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And Robert Hooke took that personally because Robert Hooke was about 5 foot tall. There was a good deal of animosity between the two. But it's unprecedented to burn someone's portrait. And you've got to figure out Isaac Newton he must have known what he was doing.
Even Isaac Newton was not beyond making midget jokes,
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, exactly. I mean, they're there for the taking, aren't they? Robert Hooke was a horrible person. He took a huge amount of opium. He experimented on himself with drugs all the time. There's an hilarious quote from him about taking cannabis. I mean, he was a very, very, very keen self-medicator. Not at all a reliable person, died fairly young and very cranky, and was just, I think, the archetypal mad scientist. Some of the quotes from Hooke are just batshit crazy. Writing about cannabis. The dose of it is about as much as to fill a common tobacco pipe. The leaves and seeds being dried first and pretty finely powdered, this powder being chewed and swallowed or washed down by a small cup of water, doth in a short time quite take away the memory and understanding, so that the patient understands not, nor remembereth anything that he sees, heareth, or does, and in an ecstasy, but becomes, as it were, a mere natural, being unable to speak a word of sense, yet he is very merry, and laughs, and sings, and speaks words without any coherence, not knowing what he saith or doeth, yet he is not giddy or drunk, but walks and dances, and shows many odd tricks. After a little time he falls asleep, and sleeps very soundly and quietly, and when he wakes up he finds himself mightily refreshed and exceedingly hungry.
I mean, why would he say about the leaves and seeds? That just sounds like he doesn't really know what he's talking about there.
Yeah, no, that was him talking to the Royal Society. That was his official report into taking an electrory of cannabis, of bang, which I think was a form of hash.
Wow. I wonder if he was trying to give it a bad image, saying like, oh, they don't remember anything. They just...
He was actually of the opinion that taking drugs made you more like God.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well,
You heard it here first, folks. Taking drugs gets you closer to God.
He had a thing that, something like by use of art and experiment and by using certain techniques, he could think in godlike terms. He really did enjoy getting high, I think it's fair to say. I mean, he did some remarkable things. He's a famous scientist, but he also made a very, very detailed study of the flea, knew all about its life cycles, its preferences, its ecology, you could say. And he did all that all in the run-up to the 1665 plague, which didn't hit anywhere else. It's very, very, very strange and slightly scary. Mad scientist who had his portrait burned by Isaac Newton.
I'm struggling to think what drug you take, where you're like, I'm going to make a plague.
Well, I'm glad I've never had any, because I have to say, there's stuff in Hooke's diary about Christopher Wren being very sick for a few days after him experimenting with whatever he was experimenting with. They call them electrories or whatever, just medicine they decided to take because they fancied it. And they had some quite spicy. I mean, cocaine had come over with the Stuarts. The Stuarts were very keen on cocaine. Opium was available, hash was available. There were all kinds of different concoctions available. And they were gentlemen, and they thought, well, I know what I'm doing. I'll have some of this and then I'll have some of that. And there's some bits in Hooke's diary that are mental, because it's just like, I had some of this and it made me feel like that. So I had some of that made me feel like this. And then I fell asleep and I woke up and I shat myself.
Which one of their friends, I think it's one of their friends, is the one that took a shit on a crowd of people or something off a balcony?
Well, that was Lord Sedley. This is all written down in his diary. But what's definitely true is the Stuarts, while they were in exile, they got friendly with the Spanish and fought actually the English army on the side of the Spanish on the continent. And they got friendly with Spanish officers, and Spanish officers had found cocaine to be useful on the battlefield, right? Makes everything better, I guess. So they came back to London and brought cocaine with them. Now, Lord Sedley was one of Charles II's sort of best mates. He was apparently a very witty man, he wrote some poetry and all that sort of thing. He was an aristocrat with a good sense of humour. Now, for whatever reason, one day, I think it was called the Cock Inn on the Strand, which is a major road in London, stood out on the balcony, bollock naked, and started making a sermon to all the people below him, started going on about how this was great, how that was great. At one point, he washed his dick in his wine and saluted the king to it, And he also said, this is the quote that stands out, that he had such a powder on him, that would make all the cunts in London run after him. He then to sort of, as a sort of punctuation mark on his little sermon, he shat all over the people below. Now, he was fined 500 quid for, breach of the peace or whatever. And Charles II paid that £500 fine. Lord Sedley was said to have remarked he thought it was the first man who had ever had to pay for shitting.
Wow.
So he had quite an attitude to him. So that's Lord Sedley, one of Charles II's sort of friends. They partied like there was no tomorrow. Charles II's court was known for being very debauched and hedonistic and all that sort of thing. Oh.
I had no idea that they were so bad, but you can see it, can't you? You can see it.
Well, they've got nothing to do, have they? I mean, you're king, you get £1 million a year income, whatever, you've got all the nice places to live in, everyone's being a sycophant. What are you going to do? He ended up having like 15 illegitimate kids and dying young because he just partied too hard.
Imagine living in the 17th century, though. Your coke dealer would have been Lord Sedley.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would have been illegal at that time. So if you'd known the right apothecary, you could have just popped along and, I guess, bought it off the shelves. But Robert Hooke, when the first boatload of bang, the first boatload of hashish turned up, he befriended the captain and they spent about a month together.
That's actually really funny.
Yeah, I know. Like, ate a lot of bad food and, probably watched some shit on Netflix and then got on with life after.
Disappeared for a month and nobody saw him.
They smoked a boat's worth of hash. Yeah, so they were quite an exotic bunch. I mean, it's not this whole idea that everyone back then was very prim and proper is just not true at all. People like to have a good time. Robert Hooke being someone who really liked to have a good time. Like I say, some of his diary entries are mad because he'd literally try one thing in the morning, it made him feel all ill, so he'd try something else that would make him feel something else. And his diary is just a list of all the things, the drugs he was taking, trying to sort his head out. This is Robert Hooke just saying, took spirit of Sal Almanac with small beer at supper, very feverish all night but slept well, strangely refreshed in the morning by drinking Sal Almanac again with small beer and sleeping after it, purged me twice, and this is a new great discovery in medicine. So basically he's taking stuff that making him so ill he's vomiting, and then he's saying how well it's making.
Yeah, I've only heard purge before when they talk about in ayahuasca ceremonies. They go go to Peru and this will make you shit yourself for 5 hours and then you meet God.
I think he skipped the meeting God bit and just went to the shitting himself. Took a volatile spirit of wormwood which made me very sick and disturbed me all night and purged me in the morning. Drank small beer and spirit of Sal Almanac, purged me 5 or 6 times very easily Sunday morning. This is certainly a great discovery in physics. I hope that this will dissolve that vicious slime that has so much tormented me in my stomach and guts.
Yeah, he thinks he has a slime in his stomach, and he is just looking around the room like, can I take this?
George's marvelous medicine gone mad. I mean, he was a danger to himself. He was a danger to other people. He loved his opium.
Say he helped orchestrate a plague, probably.
Something to do on the weekend, isn't it? I guess I don't know. I mean, if the history again, Robert Hooke was pretty much written out of our history. You don't find much mention of him until the last 40 or 50 years. Specifically, a lady called Lisa Jardine kind of brought him back and even claimed she found the portrait that Newton had burnt, but it turned out that wasn't that portrait, and that portrait was burnt. So Robert Hooke goes down in history as being the man who was the only man in the history of the Royal Society who's had his portrait burnt. For whatever reason, Isaac Newton didn't like him.
And it's interesting, you talked about the nutmeg, and when I was looking into the nutmeg, because I wanted to find out when we actually found it. Apparently, the Romans were purchasing or importing 3.5 million pounds of nutmeg a year from Egypt at one point.
Okay, didn't know that. What I understood was that the nutmeg that at least that was around at the time I'm talking about only was found on a few islands in Indonesia. They're called the
Yeah,
Banda.
well, Egypt presumably were getting it from there and then
Right.
selling it.
Oh, I get
They
you.
think that they were getting it from Chinese traders that were in the Moluccas Islands, which is where Bandas is,
That,
and
that
in that
makes sense.
area
I
of
thought you meant it
Indonesia.
was growing in Egypt. I had no idea.
No, I don't think it was. No,
Ah,
but they were importing 3.5 million pounds, which is obviously a lot. So the Egyptians must have had a spice trade going to the same areas. So there's loads of people will have had this spice trade, and it's like we talked about yesterday on the phone. The Mongols. The Mongols were the
yes.
ones that literally turned this into a biological warfare. They would fire they catapult body parts or feces into cities, and then sit there and go, right, give that 10 minutes. And that was like one of the things that they used to do. They'd use the Silk Road. They figured out that they could actually keep the virus almost incubated for the journey of the Silk Road by grabbing somebody who's infected and riding him as fast as they can. They realize, we can actually get it to the end of Silk Road. So they,
Deliveroo, disease-aroo or something like that.
yeah, basically, yeah, they figured out, we can actually we can get it all the way from one end of the Silk Road to the other without the infection dying, and then we can pass that infection on to whoever we want. So they
Yeah,
could literally, I mean, there's cases in America, isn't there, of groups going into Native Americans, catching them, bringing them, making them hang out with people that have like smallpox, and then sending them straight back in, and
yeah.
then go and watch the
Well,
damage.
no. You just reminded me, and thank you. Christopher Wren was a director of the Massachusetts Bay Company, and they infamously gave Native Americans from around their blankets, and those blankets have been used by people who had been suffering from smallpox. So that when they gave these blankets to these Native Americans who had no natural immunity, it decimated them.
So it's
Yeah.
Wren again.
Well, that's a business associated with Wren, or Wren was made rich by being a director of it.
But I genuinely think that around the 15 to 1600s, it became Europe's number one tactic to deal with anything. Just go and give them a virus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at how humans treat humans today. I mean, it's horrible, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility, is it? And
Well, the way we've got it down, isn't it, that it's an accident. We say, because we've never seen the South Americans, they have no immunity to our diseases. So the minute that the Europeans turned up and coughed, they died.
obviously, I mean, once someone worked out that they didn't have immunity to smallpox, you'd hope that they'd try and think of a way of vaccinating them, not giving them the disease and killing them. Do you know what I mean? But
I was just going to say that even in the Arabic days, I remember seeing they actually have the mental hospitals where obviously the patients, whether they're mental or not, is irrelevant. But they'd just be giving you, whatever drugs, just give them, see what happens. The ancient Chinese were doing this. They were in the pursuit of philosopher's stone, turn anything to gold, kind of. They were in the pursuit of that. And at one point particularly around the 6 to 7, 800 AD. They were trying anything they could get their hands on, mixing it together, going, what does that do? That's how they found gunpowder. They were like, oh, this one sets on fire. And it's nuts to think how much of that was going on without them having any idea about keeping stuff contained. They were putting people in essentially petri dishes, handing them loads of stuff, and then going, let's see what happens.
Let's see what. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there was a very famous Chinese doctor who paid good money to meet people who've been shot in the head by an arrow, because different kinds of brain damage. It wasn't long before people were finding people they didn't like, just shooting him in the head with an arrow and then selling it for a price.
That reminds me of the snakes story. Is it in India when they wanted to get rid of all the snakes in India? So they said, we'll pay for snakes. So obviously people just started breeding snakes.
Yes.
Yeah, they increased the population of snakes. And then when they said, right, we're not going to pay you any more money for these snakes, they all released them into the wild. So now there's even more snakes than there were before.
Was that the
go,
British?
damn it.
Yeah.
The British thought, I know how to sort this out. Bit of capitalism. But
yeah, it's our answer to everything, right?
This is on the plague that we can bring up. How New York was traded with the Dutch.
Oh yeah, okay. So the war being fought between England and the Dutch was the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665 to 1667. At that time, England had laid claim to one of the Banda Islands in Indonesia, now Indonesia, where the nutmeg came from. And what we did when we signed a peace treaty with the Dutch was we agreed to give up our Spice Island in the Banda Islands in exchange for Manhattan Island, what was called at the time New Amsterdam. James, Duke of York, decided to rename New Amsterdam New York after himself as Duke of York. And it was really then that he was able to use his new Royal Africa Company to import slaves into America, because it was illegal to have slaves in England, but they'd worked it out so that in the colonies in America it was possible to have slaves. So the Dutch gave up Manhattan, gave up New York for nutmeg. And some people go, oh, isn't that funny? It's a bit of a trope. Oh, the Dutch are so stupid, they gave up all of Manhattan for the nutmeg trade. But no one understands, of course, that nutmeg saved you from plague and was the most valuable commodity in the world. It was more valuable by weight than gold. So yeah, that's why the Dutch gave up Manhattan. Just in summary, the year 1665 to 1666, the poet laureate at the time, Daniel Dryden, called it the Year of Miracles. And a series of events happened that had no precedent in history. Nothing like them's ever happened before or since. And really, you just got to ask yourself, I mean, do you believe in miracles? Because if you don't believe in miracles, then there has to be some kind of explanation for why all these disasters happened. And the fact that it was all meant to be, or at least the fire was meant to be an accident, and then you go to the official parliamentary report into the fire and it states that the fire was arson, you've got to ask yourself what's going on, because we're not being told the truth about our own history. And it's really quite amazing that a country, I don't know any other country's history as well as I know, Britain's history, but our history is a pack of lies. This was manifestly arson. The Great Fire of London was arson, according to all the credible witnesses there at the time. And yet we get told when we're 5, oh, it all happened by accident. It blows my mind that we live in a country that treats its subjects with so little respect. I mean, we literally get lied to on our first day of school. And I still find it hard to believe that it's true, but it is true. Everyone there at the time, all the credible witnesses.
Definitely say that the fleas and the fire seem like they're part of one big attack on London, orchestrated by Wren and his boys.
Thank you. Yeah, in revenge for the City of London being the force behind the Civil War, they wanted to bring the City of London to its knees.
And I suppose as well, the City of London represented one of the biggest power obstacles, for them. If somebody's standing up to you like that and has the power to, like you say, lock the gates on the king, they can't be having that. So they probably really thought, we need to take this city down and reconstruct it so that we are the ones in charge, not these guys anymore.
Yeah, the king wasn't technically allowed to come into the City of London without permission. That goes back to at least the Magna Carta. So the City of London had privileges, and it was incredibly wealthy. When Charles I really annoyed them and tried to damage business, they were just too rich and powerful. The bankers, the traders, they were all just too rich and powerful. They bought an army, they bought the equipment, and they laid waste to the royalists. And the royalists were in shock, because suddenly all these merchants, all these people involved in trade had kicked them off the throne. So they were very motivated to bring the city down, and ultimately they failed. And ultimately the City of London created the biggest empire the world's ever seen, which is the British Empire, and spread capitalism. And now we all get to live in the 6th mass extinction event because capitalism's fucking everything. And that all started.
I'm glad that's your opinion. I'm very anti-capitalist.
Well, I mean, that is history. That's what's happened. The British Empire went around and just butchered and commodified everything. And that all started 1666. This is the sort of turning point, a very, very, very pivotal moment in British history. Therefore, it became world history.
And you talk as well, don't you, about how Britain essentially robbed India of its wealth. It went in, they controlled something like 20% of the global economy. And by the time Britain was done with it, there wasn't much left.
Yeah, this is, there's a great book called Inglorious Empire by Indian statesman Shashi Tharoor. It just details, like, India was a very, very prosperous place when England got there, which is why they wanted to take it all. And it's something like, someone did a calculation, I think it was something like 45 trillion pounds in today's money worth of stuff was just robbed, taken out of India. The gold, the spices, anything that, wasn't bolted down, typical capitalist fashion, they stole and brought back to Blighty. So nearly every great house in England is built using money that was earned off the back of slaves, really, or serfs.
And they banned the one of the biggest trades, essentially. Well, they didn't ban it, but they brought in the taxes, didn't they, on the cotton, the Indian looms. They didn't want them.
Mean, this is one thing Shashi Tharoor points out, that one of the major products the East India Company had to sell was, cotton from England, and no one in India they had very, very nice fabrics. Thank you very much. Apparently you could pass a sari through a wedding ring. The cloth and the fabric was so fine. Very, very ancient tradition of incredibly expert weavers. And so the East India Company came along with their rough cotton. India was like, nah, no thanks. So the East India Company shut down the weavers in Bangladesh, and when the weavers didn't like that, they smashed up the looms to stop them weaving. And when people carried on weaving, the East India Company cut off people's thumbs to stop them weaving. This is what Shashi Tharoor says. The East India Company was a wealth extraction process. They just found places, where there was wealth, they'd take it. Something like 20-25% of the world economy was what India represented when the English got there. It was like less than 5% or something like that when they left. There were less people being able to read. There were less people living as long. Britain impoverished India. They built the railway there, but the railway was actually very, very expensive to build. And the British only built it so that they could move goods, and make more of a profit. They didn't really build it for passenger at all. They built it for freight. You could talk about what the East India Company did in China and the Opium Wars. I mean, we don't get taught about that. Every kid in China gets taught about the Opium Wars.
And India has still to this day, they've got the loom, don't they, on their flag, because of Gandhi telling people to weave their own stuff.
Yeah, homespun.
As a protest, wasn't it, against the British rule, to say, look, we don't want to pay your taxes, we don't want to be oppressed like this anymore. And the loom is now, like you say, on the flag of India, but it's become a national because of what we did to them.
The people who make this cotton are all working in factories in shit conditions in the northwest of Britain. The factory workers of Britain are oppressed. They're producing this cotton, and who do you think picks the cotton? It was
over slaves in America, most likely.
Why was Britain so keen on the Confederacy? Because the Confederacy supplied British manufacturing with the cotton it needed to for the factories to export to India. So it was a pretty vicious cycle of trade going on, where slave picked cotton was being exported to early factories, and that was being exported again.
And you brought up China and the Opium Wars. For background on that, at one point the Chinese had to basically say, look, we're shutting our borders because you lot won't stop bringing in your drugs and trying to give it to our people.
Yeah, please stop.
And
England, people addicted to smack, for fuck's sake,
We're going to invade you unless you accept. And they invaded twice. And in the end, the emperor fled into Manchuria, and they got his, I think it was his nephew, who was open to the idea of the opium. And they were like, look, you're emperor now, but let's do our business. And
they did
it's
all the way across India as well, like the different princes and so on. Incredibly corrupting influence. And I think it's a fair symbol of the British Empire. Clive of India, that everyone talks about, died an obese drug addict. I mean, he was just a horrible human being who picked up all kinds of weird proclivities in India, stuffed his face, was up to his eyeballs all the time, and just lived the life of a pig. And that was Clive of India, the guy who did more than anything else to civilize the dark continent. And it's just the hypocrisy. This is the thing. I mean, England, as you must know, we're in a lot of shit at the moment, because the people who run our country still think they run the world, and they're mental. It's going to take another 100 years probably for them to realize that they're no longer running an empire. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. It really is terrible. I mean, if you look at it, the city of London is probably most of the reason that we are on paper so rich.
Yes.
We don't have any resources, really. We don't produce much. All our wealth is fantasy. It's offshore banking. Our real wealth to the world is our link to offshore banking, isn't it?
Yes.
We're a doorway for America to slide its money where they don't, don't want to get taxed.
I mean, in the last 30, 40 years, anything that hasn't been screwed to the floor has been sold to mainly sovereign wealth funds out of the Gulf. So, you've got all these members of, the Gulf states who own huge chunks of England and own our water, own our electricity, own, everything. And they don't really care for democracy. They definitely don't think everyone's born equal or anything like that. The Great Fire London and all of that is just a great way of saying to people, look, this is how our country is really run, and we're the wool is kept over our eyes. I mean,
well, people think that it's in the past, don't they? And one example, when we're talking about India, we started that endeavor, in the 1800s. If you even go to Winston Churchill, somebody that's considered a hero, he shouldn't be, but he's considered a hero to our people. If you look at what he actually said about Indians during the famine, because he purposely moved a load of their grain stocks over to Europe, saying, look, we need it for the war. And the Indians were like, yo, if you do that, we're going to die. And he was like, well, fuck you. And he literally said in his diaries, the Indians are a beastly people. It's their own fault that they're in famine because they reproduce like rabbits. And terrible stuff. And that's coming from the prime minister in World War II. So it's only 80 years ago. Our prime minister hated Indian people, and he caused the deaths of millions of them by removing their food supplies.
I mean, there are a couple of things that if you look really hard, you can say about Churchill that are not horrible, but everything else, he was the worst kind of. He's the kind of person who thinks that they're born into leadership. They've got sort of a divine right to rule. And that's exactly the kind of Eton nonsense that's resulted in all the stuff we're dealing with now. I mean, the whole political economy of England is fucked because we don't, like you say, we don't make anything. The only service we provide, apart from banking, is bonds. We're not a good place to do business. No wonder poverty is on the march. And I would suggest that a lot of that poverty is not by accident, but by design. And
that goes into what you're saying with Thomas Malthus, and that whole theory.
This is a terrible utilitarian way of looking at things. Malthus said if you let people be, they'll just overpopulate the planet. And I think he said, if the population ever hits a billion, it's going to be hell on earth. And
I'd say that's exactly what Churchill was doing in India, wasn't it? He is exactly what he said. It's their own fault. They bred too much. They've caused this famine on themselves. So he felt fine removing all this grain and taking it to Europe because, like you say, well, I'm just helping them out, really, culling the population because otherwise they'll just eat their own supplies. And it's a terrible way to view it.
That'd be the last thing. I mean, he was very clear as well that, he said about Aborigines in Australia, look, he said something like, I make no apologies for the fact that a superior race, a more sophisticated race, went in and wiped them out. It's just the way of the world.
Fucking hell.
I know, and you just think...
You don't see those quotes printed on the mugs with him.
No. Well, I bet you do in Aborigine shops in Australia, though, or something like that, Yeah, I have to say, if you look at, Joris Bonson and his merry band of... I mean, you listen to anything... you don't even have to listen. You can read what he's written. Johnson's an old school English racist. He thinks anyone brown is inferior. Calling ladies wearing a hijab pillar boxes and just the worst kind of person. And that's who runs this country. And that's who thinks they can tell us, all of this happened by accident.
It's like Boris Johnson's father. He said that the British public and all of people, but British public should be limited to 2 children because of overpopulation. He said that Britain could only manage 15 million people at most, and everyone should be limited to a maximum of 2 children. He's got fucking 7 or 8, and Boris has got another 7 or 8.
They never apply their rules to themselves. I mean, that's the nature.
Oh, well, if I put more of me out into the world, that's a good thing.
You got to hope that I keep reassuring myself that with Boris, we got peak Tory, and it won't get that bad again because it can't.